Okay, I'm going to teach you how to draft a facing for any edge. I'm going to be focused on the neckline since some necklines have a binding finish, and maybe you don't want to do a binding finish. You'd like to opt for a facing, or maybe it's a different look that you want. It's going to be nice and clean finished with the facing. Mine has a overlock surged edge on the inside, but I just use fabric for the facing, and it's clean finished with no visible stitching on the outside, just an understitching on the inside. So if you'd like to try this finish, you can do this on sleeveless armholes, hems, necklines, anywhere that you have a finish. And I'm going to be using the 100 Acts of Sewing tunic #1 since it's such a simple pattern, and I think that this neckline could have all kinds of different finishes, making it look different every time you make it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trace off our pattern pieces onto paper, and you can use whatever you have. I just have a scrap piece here of what I call manila, other people call oak tag. It's just a heavier weight fabric, paper that I can trace around, but you can use cardstock, computer paper, Swedish tracing paper, scrap paper, whatever you want. I've used it all. So you're going to place your fold, and I like to make any of my pattern pieces that are cut on the fold on a folded piece of paper. You don't have to do that, but it is more accurate. And if you're just doing something quick and dirty, I don't blame you for just, you know, tracing it onto a piece of paper and only cutting out half of it. Let's see if I got my fold there. All right, trace it. Okay, so that's the back, and I'm going to move down a little bit here. So this has a same pattern piece for the front and the back, which isn't very typical. So you need to make sure you remove the back neck. I use reusable tape, that's what that magic was. And then we're going to move this down right here. Make sure you have your fold, your piece perfectly on the fold. Makes a big difference. Trace off. Okay, and for the record, I don't usually do pattern drafting with a Sharpie. It just makes it a little easier to see. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, the reason I'm doing that is I find it much easier to sew any kind of finish like facings, collars, plackets, any of that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I like to cut it down to that 1/4 inch seam allowance, which means I'm going to remove a 1/4 since it's a 1/2 inch seam. All right, so let's remove our 1/4 inch here. Make sure you have a right angle at the front here, at the fold. It's very, very important. Otherwise, you end up getting a point if you're not careful. So just make sure you have a right angle there. Remove that 1/4 inch. And I'm going to squiggle this out so I remember to cut it off. I'm going to do the same thing on the back. All right, so now we're going to determine what width we want for our facing, and usually it's in the 2–2.5 inch range, and so I typically favor 2.5 inches cut, which means I have the 1/4 inch at the neckline, and it finishes 2¼ inches wide, unless I'm sewing and turning the facing edge to clean finish it, which I'll talk about in a second. All right, so I'm going to draw a parallel line to my new cut edge that's 2.5 inches away. Okay, and the same thing, you absolutely have to have a right angle at your fold lines there. All right, so let's draw on our line. Okay, so now we're going to cut this out, but we're also going to leave it a little bit rough on the shoulder edge so that we can make sure the transition between front and back is nice and smooth. All right, so let's cut this out. And for the record, I always cut the line off, but I normally wouldn't be using a Sharpie. And even if you're using a hard lead pencil, I always cut the line off because it's outside of what I wanted. All right. All right, I'm going to staple this together since it's 2 layers to keep it accurate. And now I'm going to mark the center front, and I'm going to notch it because that gives us another sewing guide when we're going around the neckline, and then we use fewer pins or clips or whatever. So I just like to mark that center at the neckline edge right there. And I always denote it with red so I notice it when I go to cut it. Just like that. All right, so let's cut out most of our back. Okay, so we're going to lay the back and the front together at the shoulder on the seam line. So I'm going to draw in a 1-inch line because the seam allowance on this pattern is a 1/2 inch. So the seam line is actually right here, which is actually a really good reference. And then I just do another 1/2 inch so that I have a place for the back to line up, just like this. All right, and so what I like to do is I like to line it up on the seam line. So let's draw our 1/2 inch seam here on the back. And so we're going to line it up so that this little point right here hits the seam on the pattern piece there. You can see I have a little point hanging off here. And so we really want a nice transition here. And in any pattern that is a join, this is frequently overlooked on side seams and underarms. The other way you can do it if you're doing it quick and dirty, and we're kind of doing a middle of the road quick and dirty plus kind of refining the edges just because I don't want to skip over some of these details. You can kind of trim it just like that. Let's trim this one a little bit. Just like that. All right, and so let's cut our front, the rest of our front out. We'll line it up again. Now we can't really see our neckline, unfortunately, so let's flip it over. And that's just because the front and back are the same pattern piece, and you'll have a right back and a right front. You only have a right and a left. Okay, so we're going to lay this on here. Got our nice transition there. And let's look at that right there. So we want to make sure that this transition is nice and smooth. So if we need to kind of carve out a little bit to kind of get to a right angle when we get to the neckline, that works better. All right, now let's trim it up. All right, and we're going to do the same thing with our back neck, center notch right there, and then mark it in red. Okay, so we're just about ready to cut it out in fabric, so let's just mark our pattern. And I like to mark my seam allowances here. So I'm going to write 1/4 inch there and a 1/2 inch, so 1/2 inch and 1/4. So I remember what that seam allowances is on both those edges. Now, as far as it goes for interfacing, you can do whatever you want. So sometimes I just cut another layer out in fabric. Sometimes I use an alternate fabric. Sometimes I use fusible interfacing, non-fusible. I kind of am all over the place when it comes to things like that. Sometimes it's just what I have on hand, and sometimes it's what I want the garment to, how I want it to act over its time of its life. So for this, I'm just going to use fabric for both layers, so I don't want to use my fusible interfacing for this. So I'm going to write cut 1, fabric, cut 1, interfacing. So you remember to do it. Quick and dirty, right? All right. So now you can take out the staple and open it up if you like. I'm just going to leave mine on the fold since we're doing quick and dirty. All right. So since I'm going to do fabric, I don't recommend this, but I'm just doing a prototype for a video, so I'm going to cut these out at the same time. The only reason I don't recommend this is that it's highly possible to get it inaccurate, to get your folds inaccurate. I'm using really stable fabric, and most likely you aren't. You're probably using a linen or something really nice, a rayon or something like that. And then I recommend opening up your pattern piece and laying it out and cutting it and weighting it down or tracing it onto the fabric and making it really accurate. Because when facing is inside the garment, it needs to be identical to the neckline or whatever you're sewing it to, and you're going to have your best chance of success in it looking completely invisible there if it's very identical and that you cut all your pieces so precisely that they have no chance of being inaccurate. All right, so the one thing I have to remember is that I've trimmed 1/4 inch off this neckline, and I'll have to do that on my front and back piece when I cut them out of the fabric. All right, so we're going to cut these out. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is we need to mark our center so that we know that that is the center. And you really only need to do it on the outer fabric piece because you won't see the facing. You can do both, and you can also just do a little nip. Just remember your seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. This is a really nice visible way to notch things because you can see the divot, especially if you're doing it something on a serged edge, which we're not going to serge this edge, but you know, it is a nice visible notch, and especially some fabrics may be a little bit textured, and that helps. The little slit sometimes kind of gets lost, all right? So that's one way. So you can clean finish your facing by sewing, you know, your two facing pieces together, and then your, you know, your inner facing pieces together, and then your outer fabric pieces together at the shoulders. And so with your seam allowance, just like this, do 2 separate facings, and then sew those 2 facings together, right sides together around this perimeter edge. Clip and trim that edge. Turn it right side out. Understitch it if you need to, or top stitch it. Press it really well, and then you have a fully finished fabric facing ready to attach to the neckline. All right, so stay tuned for the sewing of the facing, and good luck, happy sewing. I'm just going to show you the most standard way to do it. So I'm going to, you know, if this was fusible interfacing, it would be fused to it, right? So now we're going to sew our shoulders together. I'm just treating all this as one. And you're going to line it up at that shoulder seam juncture. I didn't cut these out very nicely, but you get the idea. And if you don't know what I mean by this, I have a video I made a really long time ago, and even people who are experienced sewists are like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. You need to line up your seam right here at the seam line. So don't line up your cut edges like here. Don't line it up here. Line it up at the seam allowance. It's just a very subtle way of making sure that you're actually sewing it in the proper spot, and then everything keeps lining up, you know, because if you find things don't fit or they're not lining up, that could be it, that you're lining up your raw edges and not your seam lines. All right, so got our shoulders going, and now let's do the shoulders of our tunic. You're probably sewing a completely different garment, so I'll just sew my shoulders here and get my shoulders to match. All right, and now on this facing, I'm going to do the most standard thing that most people would do, and that is they would overlock or serge the perimeter edge here, this long edge, not the neckline, just that perimeter. All right, so let's do that. Okay, so we have our facing is overlocked on this perimeter edge, and now we're ready to go. Now make sure these are nice and flat, all right? Make sure that nothing is misaligned or buckling. That happens pretty easily. Okay, so this is pretty easy. You're just gonna put this right sides together. I like to sew from the inside of the garment like this, and if that sounds confusing, I don't have a free arm on my machine. I have a flat bed right here. And so that means that I can't put this around the arm, the bed of the machine. So when it's like that, I keep the garment like this, you know, so it's a circle. And I sew inside the garment, or whatever's the inside or outside, doesn't matter. I just sew inside this circle. And it's 1/4 inch seam allowance because we trimmed it all up. You're lining up your shoulders, and then you have that little notch at the center of your facing and your garment to keep lined up. So make sure you're not pulling anything, just keep it all lined up. It should be pretty easy to sew together because it's identical, right? We made the pieces using the exact same pattern piece. You pin this together, it's a little easier for you to work. All right, so now we're back at the center. And now this neckline you do need to clip because this is going to get folded back on itself once the facing goes to the inside of the garment, right? So let's clip this to the seam line anywhere there's a curve, especially in these thicknesses, like right here at these shoulders where there's some thicknesses. Try not to cut through your back stitch because it could kind of creep into that seam. You never know, right? So just go around. All right, so clipping that gives it the opportunity for the seam allowance to spread apart when it's being folded into the garment, just like we were talking about earlier. All right, now we're going to edge stitch this. Now this is preference. You can edge stitch this or you can top stitch your facing when it's completely to the inside of the garment. I personally like understitching the facing, and I don't like when I'm doing a facing finish, it's usually because I want something really clean and polished looking, and I don't usually put top stitching on the outside. But there's so many different neckline finishes. You can even top stitch your facing at the perimeter here on the through all layers on the outside of the garment. It just depends on what look you're going for. You can play with it and see what each one looks like. It's kind of surprising how different they look. All right, so we've pushed the seam allowance towards the facing. It's clipped, so make sure none of those little clipped flanges are flipping back towards the garment. Ironing it first would probably help, but I'm trying to keep this quick. I'm going to show you one last trick, since some of the drawbacks with the facing are that it wants to flip to the outside of the garment. I see that a lot in beginning projects. I always had that happen too. And that usually comes because when you're handling your neckline, maybe you didn't keep it as relaxed as possible. It might have gotten a little stretched out. And then maybe you didn't keep these two layers here as flat and as identical as possible. There's a lot of reasons for that. But what you need this to do is mimic the outer garment, right? It needs to be identical in every way so that it lays nice and flush in there. And it doesn't want to flip to the outside of the garment. So give it a good pressing. I didn't even press my shoulder seams. So it's kind of bubbly right there. There we go. Let's see how it looks. See, it's instantly, it's just, looks nice even, and we didn't do the binding, right? You can attach your label right here. All right, so now we have this nice neckline here, and we want to make sure that this doesn't flip to the outside because that's so common. So what I like to do, make sure you get a really good pressing and you'll have a lot more success. So when you are looking at this, lining this up, now we wanted to match our seams on the shoulders when we sewed it, right? So great if we did that, but just by chance, if maybe they're not lining up, don't fight it at this point. If it's all laying nice and you're done with your neckline seams, just leave it for this next step. So see how my seam right here isn't lining perfectly up here? That's fine. We really want it to lay as naturally flat as possible at this point. So keep this all relaxed. Open it up as much as possible here. Get this nice and flat. Iron the heck out of it. And then you're going to pin it away from the shoulder. Like put your pins away from the shoulder here. Because we're going to stitch in the ditch here. Let's open this one up here. All right. So in other words, you don't want to just pull this over to line up for the sake of lining up, because it doesn't matter now on the inside of the garment. That is done. So now you just need it to lay as flat as possible. That is your objective. I think pinning it's really smart because I tend to obviously take a lot of shortcuts, and then this is one that always backfires. So there's a few ways you can do this. If you really can't stitch through the ditch, like you don't want to stitch, stitching through the ditch means we're going to pull the seam apart and we're going to stitch in there to tack the facing to the garment. That's kind of a quick and dirty way to do it. You're going to see it in a lot of ready to wear garments. But if you don't want to do that, the other thing you can do, keeping all of this as flat as possible, is pick up this seam allowance here. And remember, this seam allowance has probably been finished. You've serged it, you've zigzagged it, you've, whatever. Even if it's a French seam and it's pressing towards the back like this, you're going to pick this up and stitch them together. Just make sure that all of this is nice and relaxed and nice and flat, right? You don't want anything pulling on the outside. You don't want anyone knowing that this is what's going on the inside. All right? So I'm going to show you stitching the ditch. All right, so let's pull the camera down. We can see the stitch in the ditch. Now I can feel my facing. It's ending right here. I can feel that lump. See, there it is right there. My pins are way far away, and I'm going to pull this apart. And you can walk your hand wheel to get in there to make sure. Kind of try and keep the seam as pulled apart as possible. And you're going to stitch in the ditch here. Definitely a quick and dirty thing. You're just going to do it for a little bit. I didn't do a very good job. Plus, if your thread matches, it's going to be a lot better. But over time, it really will blend in, especially if the thread matches. You can even do it by hand. I'm just showing you a definite ready-to-wear technique. I have a little bit of tuck there. It's probably because of the way however I clipped the neckline. Let's get this nice and flat. Here's the edge of my facing. You can really pull it apart, and you can really see a lot of holes in your stitches when you do this. Oh, I should note my needle's huge too. It's probably a 16. I haven't changed it. All right. All right, so that is how you can secure your facings. And then the only thing you're really going to have to worry about is the one at the center front. If that one is flipping up right here, then it's just because you just need to work on your technique a little bit, and it'll get better and better, I promise. And you know, if giving it a good press out of the laundry doesn't solve that, and you still have this happening all the time, just work on your technique. Make sure that these two layers are completely identical, that it's identical to the neckline. Remember, this has to be identical for it to just lay nice and hidden on the inside of the garment. So I hope adding the facing went well on your neckline, and if you need other neckline finishing options, just check out the videos after this end, and you can try your hand at binding on the inside or on the outside. Good luck, happy sewing, bye!